Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to Chris Anderson, the longtime editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, who is now the co-founder and CEO of one of the world's leading drone companies. So welcome to the first episode of what I guess we can call the 1.1 version of this podcast. The first 8 episodes had an explicit tie to my new novel, After On, in that I picked the subjects because of their connection to the book. Then at the end of each interview, my co-host Tom Merritt and I related things back to the novel and also discussed a chunk of the story. Listeners who weren't reading the book could always just tune out for that last section. If you were a non-reader, you won't notice much of a change, because this podcast will still center upon unhurried interviews with thinkers, founders, and scientists, just as it has from the beginning. But for those of you who were reading the book, you'll notice a marked change in that Tom is no longer with me at the end. Tom has his own podcasts to host, several of them in fact, and after mentoring and teaching me so much, I had to let him get back to them. So Tom, thank you again so much for your wisdom and your generosity, and you will absolutely be missed on this show. As for what's coming up, I have an amazing set of guests for you starting today, when the first of 2 entirely different people named Chris Anderson will appear on this show. 3 weeks from now, we'll be talking to the Chris Anderson who runs the TED Conference. But today, as already noted, we're talking to the Chris Anderson who was the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine for 12 years, then founded and now runs 3D Robotics, a historic innovator in the world of drones. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Chris as a founder, but I'd first like to shine a spotlight on him as a thinker, because he is one of my favorite thinkers in an industry that has no shortage of them. For example, most listeners are probably familiar with the term the long tail. This refers to the extraordinarily long and diverse lists of media titles, products, and more that exist beyond smash hits like Spider-Man or the iPhone. The digital era makes the long tail of offerings far more accessible than it ever has been before. Just think of the list of books available at Amazon versus any library, or the selection of songs on Spotify versus the dearly departed music stores of yesteryear, or all the information sources gathered up by Google. The long tail has immense societal, economic, and cultural ramifications, and it's just one of many important and broadly known concepts that our guest Chris Anderson conceived of, fleshed out, and named. Now, if you add to that the boundless influence he had on the culture and agenda of the tech world, running Wired magazine for over a dozen years, you have a major thinker indeed. That's like being the Minister of Culture for Silicon Valley. And hanging out with Chris is always a delight and an education for me. And just the tone of my voice at many points in this interview will tell you how much fun I have talking to him. So, I hope you enjoy hearing this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. And with that, I bring you not the one, not the only, but one of just 2 Chris Andersons that I will interview in the month of October. Thank you, Chris, so much for inviting me to your lovely Berkeley offices for the second or third time I've been here. It has a Wonka-like feeling to it, with all the kind of cool drones and other sort of bleepy, flashy things around it.
Yeah, less bleepy, flashy than our sort of maker era when we were making lots of drones, but more bitty, cloudy than it once was.
And before we get started, this is kind of a fun thing. As our listeners who don't know this are about to find out, despite being an intensely digital person, before becoming a tech entrepreneur, you had a long and storied history in media. And despite your incredible digital orientation, there's so many physical artifacts of your career. I mean, there are the 3 books, of course. There's over, 100 issues of Wired?
Good God.
Something like that.
12 years times 12 issues.
Yeah, over 144, a gross. And I realized coming over here that I have nothing actually physically signed by you. And, given the obscene markups that can be found on eBay, I figured I should address that. So I just got one of your your many items of media, and I'm hoping you can sign this for me.
Oh my God! Oh my God! So this is I have not actually held this artifact. Should we say what it is?
Yes, absolutely. Tell people who have heard the reaction now, and for those of you who can't see it, which is all of you.
Yes.
What are we looking at here?
Okay, what we're looking at here is a God, it's a real flashback. It's a record, as in a vinyl record,
a vinyl LP,
in a cardboard sleeve and a plastic cover, and on the back of this record, to get to the point, is a one Christopher Anderson bass. With hair.
With quite a bit of hair, almost pre-Flock of Seagulls, or maybe it's kind of a punk Flock of Seagulls.
I think if I'd had more hair, it would have been more Flock of Seagulls.
Yeah, but it's more punk. It's a much edgier look than Flock of Seagulls.
It's bleached blonde, which is probably responsible for my lack of hair today. But more to the point, it is an album from a band called Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia.
The story of that name is the story worth telling.
Yeah, let's hear the story of Yugoslavia.
Okay, so what you have here is my only album, and when I say mine, I mean not mine. It's
You're in a band. There's 4 of you.
I'm a bit player in an obscure band.
You're one of 4. That's not
one of 4. I see copyright 1982.
All right. Yeah.
And what's important about this album, which is it's all fun album, etc., is that it was the band Yugoslavia was not actually the original name of the band. This is a little bit of a sadness in this story, because this is the losing. The reward for losing a battle of the bands.
Yep.
Is that we're called Yugoslavia. We're actually called REM.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we were the toast of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. REM, I remember, did quite well.
I'll have you know.
Yeah,
That's right. And, we were releasing our first album.
Yep.
And our manager came to us and he said, it's the weirdest thing. There's this other band called REM, but don't worry. They're from Athens, Georgia. How good could they possibly be? And, but we thought and they were releasing their first single. I think maybe ours was the first EP or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we thought it'd be fun to have a battle of the REMs. And so our managers got them to, they schlepped up from Athens to Washington, D.C. in the back of their van. And
so it was you had home field advantage.
We had home field advantage. Yeah. We were in the 930 Club, which was kind of a cool spot in D.C., et cetera. And we flipped a coin to see who was going to go on first. And we won. And we did our set, and we crushed it. And, everyone loved it because they always do. And
home field, yeah.
Yeah, and then we went to the bar to sort of toast our victory. And then they came on, the Hicks from the Sticks. And their first song was Radio Free Europe, which was not only their first single, but is actually a really good song.
Yeah, well, it was Chronic Town, I guess, would have been the EP at that time.
Probably.
Yeah, it's a 5-song EP.
All I know is that it took about 2 chords before I realized that we had lost
the name.
Well, everything. Another, the crowd, the name, our pride, etc. Yeah. Another 2 chords before I realized we were kind of in the presence of something great. And then I don't think the beers got finished, and REM, to their credit, didn't even stick around long enough to rename us, except for the bass player, a guy named Mike Mills, who was a sweet guy, and he stuck around. And I may be slightly misremembering the story, but it's too good to check.
Oh yeah,
that basically our overconfidence and assuming we'd won the battle of the bands spurred his suggestion that we name ourselves Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia, which is a good name, actually.
Which is a good name. I think the umlauts over the A may be a little wrong in all senses of the word.
And then the little slash through the O. I mean, it seems a little like playful with all the.
It was, and I think this is some sort of Russian constructivist image or something like that. At any rate, this was near the end of my rock and roll career.
Yeah.
And after we were not REM, I went back to college and did something else with my life.
We are now deep into your prehistory here. And if you don't mind, I always like to start with a little bit of background. We're obviously have veered into it. So you were born in the UK, then you moved over to the US as a teen, or
as an 8-year-old.
As an 8-year-old, as a preteen. You had, you characterize it as a bit of a misspent youth.
I failed out of schools.
Plural.
But no criminal record.
No criminal record, yeah. Good. And schools, what were you on the East Coast?
I technically didn't graduate from high school when everyone else graduated, but I did eventually graduate from high school, and then I failed out of college. And then I played in punk rock bands and was a bicycle messenger until I was 25.
Wow. So you were living this, musician bohemian life, I think, in Washington, D.C., correct? Mm-hmm. Is that where you had done most of your growing up?
Yeah.
And that was where you had failed out of the majority of the schools that you failed out of was in the D.C. area?
All of them, yeah.
All of them, actually. Okay. So you're in the D.C. area.
No, I didn't fail out of all the schools in the D.C. area.
No,
all the schools I failed out of.
Yeah, that would take some doing. So So you're in the DC area, you're 25 years old, you've been living, like in a squat or something, or with a bunch of cool, really, really cool kids in their early 20s. And then you went to school and you kept it a secret out of embarrassment, right?
So yeah, I did. I eventually, at age 25, I came home from my, menial work one day and stopped at a drugstore and got a book of crossword puzzles and sat there in our, squat and did crossword puzzles. And I was about like halfway through it. And I was like, what am I doing?
This bourgeois thing.
Well, no, I've just never done a crossword. What's going on here? And I realized I must have been bored. And then it was time to grow up. But at this point, I had failed out of so many things that no one, I couldn't go to my parents and say, will you please pay for me to go back to college? This time I'm serious.
Because look, I finished these crossword puzzles.
I didn't actually finish, but got halfway through the crossword.
I got some of the hard words.
So I decided that no one should believe that I could do anything until I proved it. And so I secretly went to George Washington, which was the local school, and was not quite as good then as it is now, and got on Dean's List before I decloaked.
Wow. And before you decloaked, before you came out of the closet as a college student.
Before I came out as a college student.
And, crossword puzzles have, sociologists have said, can be a gateway drug to computational physics. And that is, in fact, what happened, right?
It is. But again, that was not because I was necessarily, I could even spell computational physics. It's just that after failing quite as badly as I had, you not only have to kind of go back to college, get good grades, but you need to do something really, really hard.
Yeah.
And it's like literally the two hardest words I could put together at the time was computational and physics.
Yeah.
And so I thought that would do it. And ultimately I found out what it actually meant. And I did it. It was hard, but it was fun.
But you ended up getting, am I right? You went to Berkeley for a PhD?
I did not get a PhD. I think I can argue with some substance that I dropped out of a PhD program.
Okay.
To the extent that I did post-grad work, but I was never really in a PhD program.
Well, that's a pretty Elon dropped out of a PhD program, the Google founders.
ABD, all but dissertation.
Steve Jurvetson only lasted a few days.
Yeah. I think that dropping out of PhD programs is the best because it shows that you're smart enough to get in, but wise enough not to complete.
Precisely. So you were in Berkeley there, and that was when the superconducting super collider shut down as well, right? And that probably a lot of opportunities would have dried up.
Yeah, all of them.
That's a lot of
Well, basically everybody. So two terrible things happened when you were doing physics in I guess this would have been the late 80s. Number one is the one that hit me in the face first, which was that China opened up for the first time and sent the first class of students to U.S. universities. And he basically had these geniuses, the smartest kids from China who'd been sort of, Olympic style picked, were sent to the best schools. And in this case, it was UC Berkeley. And, me and the other American kid were like the last two in the class. We just got crushed by how good they were. So that was one bad thing. The second bad thing is that all the job opportunities dried up because, as you know, the quest of physics, or at least experimental physics, is to get closer and closer to the Big Bang, which means higher and higher energies, which means bigger and bigger particle accelerators, and like the energy of a particle accelerator scales, or the cost scales with like the square of the energy. And so you get to 18, 24 billion, 32 billion, and boom, Congress cuts it, and that's it. No jobs.
Yeah.
So you got to go to Wall Street and invent, computational finance, which turns you into a quant. And we have the, subprime crisis to thank for that.
Yeah. It would have been a lot less expensive to complete the superconducting super collider.
As it turns out.
To suffer the crash of 2008. You do not want unemployed computational physicists.
This is like after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Basically, unemployed physicists in general are dangerous.
You need the equivalent of night basketball leagues for these guys. You just don't want them out on the street.
Just digging up imaginary particles would be better.
You would be so much safer. And so then you made the second surprising pivot of your career from punk rock to computational physics, certainly being the first one. But then you became a journalist. I mean, a science journalist.
Accident.
Yeah.
Almost sort of the one. My parents were journalists, and the one thing I promised I would never do was. And so that's accidentally what I ended up doing.
So how very punk rock of you to go ahead and do it.
Well, yeah. I'm in a zig where you zigged. I'm not sure how that works. So here's what happened. When physics cratered, in terms of physics, you were left with what else were you doing when you weren't doing physics? And it turns out we were doing the internet. That's what the internet was designed to do, is connect physics labs. It turns out that we were doing big data. because that's the only big data around was physics data, supercomputers, statistics. And it turns out that we were doing the web. The web was created at CERN, the physics lab.
Of course, yeah.
And so we physicists may not have been able to do physics, but we could do the internet, and we could do big data and stats and all this stuff. And so that's why, when I didn't want to go to Wall Street to be quant. And so I decided I was just going to, this internet thing that we used was probably going to be big. Thank you, Wired magazine, for revealing that.
Okay. So you were reading Wired. The first issues of Wired came out in 92. 93. And you were reading and being influenced by those.
Absolutely. At this point, I was working for one of the journals, Nature.
Okay. So you started at Nature.
Absolutely. But that was still kind of a safe place for scientists, and everyone was an academic of some sort. So it was a safe place for scientists, and these are journals, but it wasn't really media, traditional media.
No.
But then Wired comes out, and Wired's like this internet thing, which at that time, people were still calling the information superhighway, right, or ARPANET or something like that. This is going to change the world. It's social revolution, cultural revolution, end of the nation state. You remember we drank the same Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm. I have a signed copy of the first issue of Wired from Louis Rossetto, and that was equally influential to me. I was getting an MBA, which was a very boring thing to do.
Yeah. So imagine if you're kind of a nerd and you use this tool, and it's like a wrench of some sort, and you're like, it's only a wrench, but it's my wrench. I'm pretty good at this wrench. And then somebody tells you this wrench is actually a magic wand that can change the world. That would be pretty cool. That's kind of what Wired did for the internet.
But at that time, you were still fairly removed from the consumer press and magazines like Wired, because you first spent several years writing for each of the two leading scientific journals, one of which, of course, is creatively titled Science, the other of which is called Nature.
Science and Nature, yeah. So it was very much in the science world. But then I decided this was bigger than science, that this internet thing was going to have application outside. And I was just going to follow that story. And a lot of people from that era decided that, especially from the science side of that era, kind of created the internet. So you commercialized, you went from ARPANET to, the internet, the .com thing, the commercial use was allowed, the web was created, then it became cultural and content and all this music and things like that. And so I decided that the internet was the biggest story of the day, might be my life, and that I was going to follow it. And so then I went to The Economist, which, typically was hiring scientists out of the journals, but I convinced them to start the internet beat. And this was 93, so it's early days.
93?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very early. That's remarkable.
Maybe it was 94.
Yeah, but in that time frame.
Yeah.
So that you covered the rise of the internet for The Economist. And then coming full circle, you became the editor-in-chief. Was editor-in-chief your first position at Wired? Mm-hmm. And that was 2001, am I right?
Yeah.
And then, so your tenure there was extremely long, longer than really the folks who'd founded it.
12 years, yeah.
Yeah, 12 years.
Longer, yeah. Although not as, we all worship at the feet of Louis and Jane. So I actually had dinner with Louis last week, and he continues to be a mentor.
Oh yeah,
all Wired editors must go and pay and do the pilgrimage
and pay homage.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there is something special in any company about being the founder. There's no question. Even if the later CEO comes along and shapes it in bigger ways than the founder.
Well, but especially when there is not just a DNA but a worldview. Louis and Jane and Kevin and John had a particular worldview, which I think at the time was slandered as anarcho-capitalist, anarchy plus capitalism. But that
anarcho, not narco.
No,
like
anarcho-capitalist, exactly. But that particular worldview was so Wired and so, Louis and Jane and Kevin to some extent, and so distinct, especially in a world of sort of homogenized media.
Yeah.
That it was necessary to kind of refresh, the founding Kool-Aid for all new editors.
Well, it was so right. And those who denigrated it were so smug. I mean, the pitch of people who were saying, oh, this internet is nonsense and it's overhyped and it's so stupid in 1998, 99. I would challenge anybody to go back and look at anything that was in Wired in the late 90s that was predictive about the significance of all the things that were going on digitally and prove that they were just overhyped. Anyway. So in the midst of all this is the pivot that in many ways fascinates me the most, because you had been very, very much a thinker and a writer and a person who operated heavily in the realm of ideas. But of course, when you take over as editor-in-chief of an operation as large as Wired, you become intensely operational, whether you want to or not. Yep. But it's a relatively rare editor-in-chief of any magazine of any scale that starts a raw startup. And you did that. Now you did it in a very, very unusual sequence of events that I'd love to go through. So we are sitting in the offices of 3D Robotics, which some might imagine as a 3D printing company or something, but it's a drone company. And the roots of it as a company and the roots of your fascination with drones definitely obviously extend into your tenure at Wired. Tell us the Lego Mindstorm story, because I think it's kind of it's a great tale.
The moral of this tale is that you can take the guy out of computational physics, but you can't take the computational physics out of the guy.
Which is why crossword puzzles are so very dangerous. Yes, they lead to that.
Weaponized puzzles. So basically, this is a case of parenting gone horribly wrong. I've got 5 kids. My wife and I, we met at Nature. We're both, technical, scientific, and the kids are sort of not. And, that shall not stand. So we're constantly trying to inspire them with nerdy projects. And it's just not working. So I thought, so every weekend I would come home from Wired and, there's these products would come in for review and you could take something home for review, for the weekend if you promised to review it.
Or if you run the magazine.
That would be abuse of power.
All right.
So, this one Friday, there was the new Lego Mindstorms NXT robotics kit had just come out. And then there was like a radio control airplane. And I thought, Saturday we'll make a robot. Sunday we'll fly a plane. Something's going to stick.
Yeah.
So we did that. I got gather around, kids. We're going to build a Lego, robot. The kids like Lego enough. And, but it turns out that building a robot of any sort is really boring, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it takes forever.
Yeah.
Second of all, when you're done, what you have is a plastic thing that rolls slowly towards a wall, as opposed to Transformers. And so they couldn't believe how boring that was. And then I'm like, okay, well, tomorrow we're going to fly a plane. So we watch videos of acrobatics and we go to the park and I fly it into a tree, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And so they're like, predictably that sucked.
Yep.
And I said, no, actually, predictably that did suck. How would that have sucked less? I thought, well, if we'd had a cooler robot and a better flying plane, that would have sucked less. Maybe if the robot had flown the plane, maybe if it was a flying robot, that would have sucked less. And I literally Googled flying robot. And if you do this,
particularly in whatever year it was.
Maybe even today, actually.
Maybe even today.
If you Google flying robot, you will discover that a drone is a flying robot.
Yep.
And then you say, okay, what's a drone? And if you Google a drone, you'll find out that it's essentially a plane with a brain. Yep. It's got some sort of, no human on board. There's some sort of machine. If you find out what is this autopilot, it turns out that it's a combination of sensors and computers and, magnetometers and accelerometers and gyros, et cetera, which is kind of more or less what was in the box.
Yeah.
The Lego Mindstorms box.
Yeah.
So I'm like, kids, I've Googled 4 times. At the end of the Googling, it said something about software and hardware. So here we have software and hardware in front of us. Let's make an autopilot out of Lego. And they're like, all right, we did that and it kind of almost worked. And we stuck it in a plane and it kind of almost worked. And went to the field and it kind of almost worked.
So it's a Mindstorm plane at this point.
It's basically it's a balsa wood plane with a Mindstorm stuck in the cockpit.
That's cool.
And it controlled the surfaces and it had a little Bluetooth connection to a GPS device. And it didn't wasn't like fully autonomous, but it was semi-autonomous. And
what year is this?
2007.
Wow, that's early.
Yeah. So the kids thought that was, mildly amusing for 10 minutes. And my mind was blown.
Wow.
I was like, because if you continue Googling, you will discover that drones are military industrial technology. Sure. They're export controlled. They're extremely classified. They're purely, super, super high tech. And the fact that my kids and I had just made one out of Lego on the dining room table should not be possible.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much that I was into drones. I just rarely have an experience where I accidentally, there's that word again, accidentally encounter, the impossible. And just the fact that I'd accidentally, with my children, created a fully semi-autonomous drone, and we've essentially weaponized Lego.
Right.
Made me sort of ask, how did that happen? What in the world has changed that allows me to do this? So I set up a community called DIY Drones.
An online forum, basically.
An online forum.
Yep.
Yeah, but it was blogs, and it was a social network. So earlier it would have been a blog, maybe earlier would have been a forum. This was now a social network. And it was largely to ask the question, what the heck is going on here? What combination of things, of software and hardware and sensors and computing, et cetera, makes this interesting thing accessible to regular people? And so the breakthrough was just the notion that you could put the letters DIY in front of a traditional industry, which, by the way, is the story of the personal computer. It's the story of the internet. Anytime you can put the letters DIY
or homebrew
or desktop or personal in front of some traditional industry, there's something bigger than technology at play. This is a social moment.
Yeah. DIY nukes, for instance. Huge community.
Thankfully not, but biology.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, certainly will be. No question.
Will be.
Yeah,
and energy and things like that. And cars, which we'll get to in a moment. And so, what happened is that year 2007 just turned out to be the right year. It wasn't that I was particularly insightful. It's just that it was a signal that had propagated into the ether. And anyone who was paying attention to as the editor of Wired, it was kind of like my job to pay attention.
Yes.
But anyone who was paying attention there was this glitch in the matrix, and it's suddenly hardware, which had been sort of once cool back in the homebrew computing era in
70s.
In 77.
Heathkit and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. It got uncool for many, many years, and then it was suddenly cool again. And you can ask, what was it? For me, it was Lego Mindstorms Brothers. It was 3D printing, the Maker movement, Make Magazine, Maker Faire. But, the big one was the iPhone.
Yeah.
That was the year the iPhone came out. And it turns out that, at least for us, the guts of an iPhone, the chips, the sensors, the camera, the wireless, the batteries, all that kind of stuff, was the supercomputer. Those components would be transformative to other industries.
Those were all the things that were missing for a robust drone, and all of a sudden they were being manufactured in scale for this one thing in the tens, then hundreds of millions of units, so they're going to get cheap and ubiquitous.
So just take those sensors, the accelerometers, the gyros. Those used to be mechanical, refrigerator-sized devices that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and were classified, and now it's a tiny chip in your pocket.
Yep.
So rather than approaching a drone as a airplane minus a pilot, we approached it as a smartphone with propellers.
And that was the philosophy of DIY Drones, the community.
It wasn't obvious in the first day. That's what we were doing. But a year or two in, we realized we were just surfing the wave that the smartphone created.
And what was going on in the community in those early days would be basically people essentially swapping recipes. So you could build
recipes, yeah.
And so it was hundreds, thousands of people.
Well, initially it was, it started with the thousands and the tens of thousands, but basically it was a fascinating interdisciplinary moment where you had software and you had hardware. So some people were writing code and some people were spinning printed circuit boards. And the recipe consisted of the following. Hey, welcome to DIY Drones. You want your own drone? Well, first, fab this PCB, then solder on these components, then load your tool chain and compile this code, then plug it into some janky radio control thing, and then good luck.
Yeah.
Which I thought was like, that's spoon feeding. But it turns out that regular people are like, come on, can you just make it for me?
Right.
And so I thought, well, yeah, I guess that is kind of reasonable.
Just to drill down on what you just said. So from your standpoint, this is cheating. This is easy. Instead of figuring it out yourself, there's
as opposed to writing the code, you just have to download and compile the code.
This is paint by numbers. But the truth is, for mere civilians, they're like, I don't want to do that stuff. Just like I look at Blue Apron and say, I don't want to cook by numbers. I want to have been cooked for. And so people wanted actual drones. And then that was the next big pivot, right?
Yeah. So then we had to we start with a kit where everything was kind of done for you. And that kit was pizza boxes assembled on the dining room table by those same children.
By your kids.
By just the ones.
So now
they'll do everything once.
You have now started a company then at this point.
Well, no.
You're still servicing the community.
I'm servicing the community, prepping pizza boxes for maker fairs, things like that. Classic maker movement stuff. But the problem is they sold out really fast. And I'm like, that's fantastic. Our product's popular. And the kids are like, yeah, whatever. And I say, you know what that means? And they're like, no, it means you're going to have to make more.
Yeah.
And they're like, not going to happen. So I had to find help. And there was just this guy on the internet in our forums who was just the smartest guy around. He was flying a helicopter with a Wii controller. And his name was Jordi Munoz. And I'm like, Jordi, you're super smart. Do you want to help make some boards? And he's like, sure.
And he was just somebody who's super active on the boards.
Yeah, never met him. Meritocracy. He had the best code.
Yeah.
So I said, what are you going to need? And he says, I'll probably need about $500 worth of parts. So I sent him a check for $500, and he just kept sending me these pictures.
Where was he?
Well, I didn't know.
You didn't know?
Eventually, it turned out he was. I think at the time he later told me he was in Riverside, California. But what to cut the long story short, a couple of years in, this which is now a company is now making more drones than all of America's aerospace companies combined. Has factories in San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico.
This is the company that
the company that Jordy basically built with my $500 of investment and managing the community on one side while he did the hardware on the other side.
So you co-founded it, the two.
We co-founded it. Yeah. But I met him a few years in. I went down to see him.
Wait, you started the company and it was years later when you had this large concern that you met him for the first time.
Yeah, in a hotel. And it turns out that I'd accidentally created a 21st century aerospace company with a teenager from Tijuana that I met on the internet.
Wow. You had no idea that he was that young.
No. Well, by the time I finally met him, he was like 21, 22 maybe or something like that.
A former teenager, yes.
When he first joined, he was just graduated from high school. He was about 19.
Yeah.
He was married young, and he and his wife were waiting for the child to be born, so they decided to move to the U.S. to have their child born. Mm-hmm. And he had some time to spare. And so he built basically, with just brilliance and gumption, built a series of factories, including quite a large drone factory in Tijuana.
And this is still your company, and it's still the $500 that's running at this point?
50-50, no investment came in, running purely on cash flow.
And how large at this point in terms of like headcount or top line or whatever metric you find most relevant?
$5 million in annual revenues, 40-ish employees.
You and Jordy from the $500. Mm-hmm. And you're still running Wired at this point.
Yeah.
Wow. So what year are we up to now?
2012. Late 2012.
And that's about when you did eventually leave, obviously.
Yeah. So at that point, once I realized that we were, going to do more than $5 million in revenues that year, and that he de-risked the thing brilliantly, and that it was time to go from bags of boards. We were still selling just basically bags of boards.
So people were assembling themselves.
They were. I mean, so the big triumph was that we pre-soldered components onto the boards from them, because it turns out people suck at soldering.
Oh, well, yeah, we do.
Yeah. So at this point, it was bags of boards. It was clear that it needed to be turned into a consumer electronics product where it
flies out of the box.
Flies out of the box, exactly. And we just weren't going to do that with cash flow and learning as we go. So we raised money to basically ramp up to mass production, move production to an outsourced operation in China, have a consumer electronics product, and go big.
Yeah.
Or go home.
And that was 2012.
And when that was early 2013.
So, and you raised the money, and I assume multiple rounds of financing.
And we did multiple rounds of financing. And we ended up going head to head with an amazing company called DJI out of China, and produced a good product called Solo, but we were targeting $1,500 as a price point.
Yeah.
And by the time, like 6 months after releasing it, the price had gone to about $600.
The retail price of
competitive, equally good competitive products. Never seen prices fall like that. So basically demonetized. At least the price declines of that industry basically forced U.S. companies out of the consumer market. But fortunately, there is another chapter.
There is another chapter, which we'll get to in a moment. But just to talk about this chapter, so your bill of materials at that point, you were targeting a $1,500 price point. Your bill of materials, I assume, was about $750.
It should have been $750. It was closer to $850.
Closer to $850, and you are selling against something that is literally priced at $600.
Yeah,
that's tough. Were you selling throughout that period, or was there a long period where you went dark when you stopped doing kits and started doing?
No, we kept selling the kits throughout. Kits are the Bermuda Triangle of the maker movement, because it's very easy to make a kit.
Yeah,
but kits have a customer support requirement that's just crushing. Because people will assemble kits wrong.
Yeah, well, of course they will.
And when they assemble kits wrong, and there's lots of ways to, unless you make a really good kit, and there are some bad.
I'll assemble an IKEA bookshelf wrong. Of course they're going to assemble a drone wrong.
And so, literally, I would wake up in the morning. I'm CEO of this company. I wake up in the morning, and there's 100 to 150 emails in my inbox, directly to me, saying, you suck, the product sucks, and I want my money back. And you look, and you just realize that they had soldered it upside down, or they're backwards, or cold joined, or it was just like, I cannot emotionally handle other people messing up soldering because it's just no fun to wake up to those kind of complaints. So we're like, okay, we're going to solder for them, and then we're going to compile the code for them, and then we're just going to stick it in a plastic box, and it's just going to work. Yeah. And every time we took took a complexity out of the equation, the tech support would drop by like an order of magnitude. So basically, I'm anti-kit. And I'm not anti-kit because I don't enjoy making kits. I'm anti-kit because I don't enjoy supporting kits.
When you were at peak hardware, what was your hardware revenue? Kits and completed drones. Did you get into the tens of millions?
Oh, kits and completed drones?
Your whole top
we were on
line.
a $100 million run rate.
You were on a $100 million run rate. You got pretty big.
Well, when I say run rate.
I know.
We didn't complete that year.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. There was at least one month where you were in the $10 million a month range. Yeah. Now you had an interesting idea at the time, and I remember reading about it. I think it was in the book Makers. You've written 3 books, right? The Long Tail,
Free. Long Tail is the sort of the concept of infinite choice and all that kind of stuff. Free was the second book, which is basically the business model of the long tail, which is the marginal cost is 0, so charge 0. And then Makers is just the long tail of hardware.
So open source software was very much out there as a concept. You talked about open source hardware, and I believe it was in Maker. It might have been in an article that you were Makers. It might have been an article that you had written. Could you briefly review the open source hardware vision as it was then? Because it was really compelling.
The reason Jordy and I were able to do this is all because of open source hardware and software. So our first product was called, Blimpduino. Blimpduino, which was an autonomous blimp based on Arduino. And the second product was called ArduPilot, which was an autopilot based on Arduino. So you can sort of see what's going on here. We're building a lot of this on Arduino.
Yep.
And, the Maker movement was very much built on the notion of open source hardware because the Maker movement is really about the physical, the tangible stuff. So there were a number of projects in 2007 that were extremely influential. Arduino was one of them. In 3D printing, there was something called the RepRap.
Yep, British company, right?
It wasn't even a company. I think it was just a community. But it was out of Europe, maybe British.
Yeah.
There were a few others, but those two in particular were the most influential. And they were open source hardware. And the notion of open source hardware was that the same deal that you could share designs so that people would remix and modify those designs, and it would just get this virtuous cycle. And it worked brilliantly with both of those, Arduino and 3D printing. I believed at the time that hardware has every much as promise as open source software. I have subsequently changed my mind about that, and I think actually open source hardware was a brief moment in time, but is not sustainable. And I'll say so with a lot of scar tissue. So open source is based on the notion that you have very low barriers to entry. Yep. Anybody can code. And then if anybody can code, then some people are going to be coding non-professionally. And there's a social incentive to share because you get non-monetary rewards like recognition and participation. Now, hardware had not typically been part of that because the barrier to entry to hardware had been very hard.
Yeah.
Most people just didn't have the skills, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, etc. There was a brief moment around the 2007 phase when there were a couple chips that were out there, and the Arduino platform, got out there with a kind of a reference platform by which you could hand solder a board. It's called through-hole pins. So they were little pins, and the pins were big enough that you could hand solder them. And they were 2-layer boards, so you could kind of, you could almost, etch them yourself or drill them or have them fabbed, etc. So it looked accessible the way hardware was. And so we all...
The way software was.
The way software was, exactly. Yeah. So we all got excited about that. And RepRap was also based on the same sort of, classic through-hole pins. The problem with that whole model is that it was based on relatively slow speed, very, very kind of, not very powerful chips, which is fine because it wasn't about the power of the chips, it was about the power of the community. But as we started to use these things, we wanted more and more power. We went to more powerful chips, and then suddenly you couldn't solder them anymore. And the more you look like a smartphone in terms of the components, the more you look like a smartphone in terms of the complexity of the assembly. And now I'm going to nerd out here for a second. Sure. Now you're a surface mount, fine pitch, 4-layer boards, 6-layer boards, design tools that are no longer free and no longer accessible. And I can't do hardware anymore.
So the barrier to entry for contributors went right through the roof.
So now if you release your design of a relatively sophisticated board, there's only one class of people out there who can use it. And this is basically Chinese electrical engineers who will very happily take your design and compete and create a product and compete with you.
Yeah.
The people you wanted to use the design were people who were going to give back.
Right.
Other people who were more driven by the social imperative than the financial one.
Yeah.
So basically, there was a brief moment when the barrier to entry with hardware was so low that you could get the people who were using it would give back.
The barrier to contribution.
The barrier to use.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that people who had social reasons to give back would do so. And then the hardware got hard again. And at that point, it was too hard for the amateurs to use and give back.
You wrote a piece in Wired in 2012, and maybe it was sort of like your commencement piece. I'm not sure. It was probably right around the time you were leaving. And you said, if we get it right, it'll be a fantastic model for companies of all sorts. If we get it wrong, an instructive failure. So instructive.
Yeah. So, well, look, I think consumers benefited hugely.
Immensely.
Yeah. So let's just take our own products. So we created autopilots, and put them out there. And today, autopilots cost like $30. They're really good. And you can get them from China, and that's great. Now, we don't make them anymore, and I don't think anybody can make a business out of them certainly on venture economics, anymore. But it's a consumer paradise. So the Chinese call this Shanzai. Which is the notion of sort of, copying and remixing and et cetera.
Mashup kind of.
Which is mashups, exactly. Yeah. It's great for consumers. But one of the things about Shanzai is open source has a kind of implicit compact that you will give back. Sometimes an explicit compact in the form of a license, like a GPL that requires you to give back. And Shanzai does not. You can take without giving back. And many people do. And that breaks the cycle.
Got it. And so there was, I think that you described your model to me in an earlier conversation is you kind of thought there would be three phases. There'd be there would be a design phase and then a consumer phase, right, and then a B2B phase essentially. And the consumer phase, instead of lasting 3 to 5 years, basically lasted about 6 months.
Yeah, exactly.
And your competitor in China is a big part of the reason for that, right? I mean, they're an extraordinary company, aren't they?
Yeah, it didn't last longer than that for them. Yeah. So we there was going to be the core technology, which went great. And by the way, that core technology we built lives on very, very happily in the Linux Foundation. There's something called Drone Code, which is the industry consortium. So all that open source software is there and used today by hundreds of thousands of vehicles. So very proud of that. The consumer phase went straight to China, commodified, at the speed of light. And it wasn't just, it'd be easy to regress to the old trope that Chinese just copied and they made it cheap. They didn't actually. DJI, I lived in China for 4 years with The Economist.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, so my family's in Hong Kong, but I was mostly in Guangdong province. And I saw the emergence of modern China. And I knew this was Huawei and companies like that at the time. And I knew that they had amazing engineers and they weren't just copying. What I didn't know, although I suspected, is that there's other elements of being a global giant: marketing, distribution, customer support, design, software, etc. It wasn't guaranteed that they would do that, but it was certainly possible. So I was expecting a giant. I was expecting good things from our Chinese competitors. And I was prepared to compete with them because we had one thing that they didn't have, which is open innovation. Yeah. Which is to say we had, essentially we could harness a community, whereas the Chinese model, China, and we can talk about this, China to this day has not really embraced open source. Well, they certainly use it, but they haven't embraced the ethos. The ethos, exactly. Yeah. So we thought that was our core asset, and that would be sufficient, that the community would innovate faster than any one company. Did not turn out to be the case.
Even if the community had, though, by dint of its open sourceness, would you not have been obligated to share the community's innovations with the world and ergo with the competitor?
For sure. But the notion would be that by owning the community, you would have unfair advantage through some method. Yeah. Yeah. It's been done before. Yeah. There's plenty of companies out there. WordPress, for example, Automatic. The Ubuntu, MySQL. There's
MySQL.
Et cetera. So it can be done.
Yeah.
And, there's no reason why, we're a pure software company. There's no reason why we couldn't, have done it. But unfortunately, with the hardware side of it, you need to, you have an extremely expensive, production process, and you get that wrong. Yeah. And now you're underwater.
You're sitting on all this stuff.
And DJI innovated really well. They did not copy. They went global first. Very few Chinese companies start global, and they did. They raised, something at a $10 billion valuation. They had 6,000 employees. They're brilliant. They had great marketing. No one has ever competed with it I don't think anyone outside of China has competed with a company as good as DJI until DJI. Even the great Chinese companies inside China, the WeChat, Tencents and Baidu's and Alibaba's, et cetera, they tend not to be big outside of China.
Right.
Even like great hardware companies in China, like Xiaomi, tended not to be big outside of China. And DJI was the first 21st century Chinese company that kind of took the Apple model and applied it outside of China first.
And lucky you to be the one to compete with them.
Yeah.
But it's almost like you were competing with, no, not at all. It's almost like you were competing with a China that you might have anticipated was 10 years out.
Yeah, no, I mean, every time I talk to people, they say, hey, yeah, so we're doing this hardware, software, we're doing this robot thing. And I'm like, you do realize that there's lots of smart people in China doing this. And they're like, that's okay. We've got, I think 3 to 5 years before they catch up. And it's like 3 to 5 months.
Trust me on this one.
Yeah, exactly. They're already working on it right now. You just don't know about it.
Now, the year of the mighty pivot for this company was 2014?
So the pivot was actually, sort of the end of 2015.
Okay, got it.
So this is when the consumer prices plummeted by like 70% in 9 months. And what we'd expected would be a gradual bridging from consumer to commercial, from drones to data.
Yeah.
Turned out to be a sort of a leap from one cliff to another.
Drones to data. Tell us what you mean by that.
When you have to justify why are you fiddling with these toys, you have to come up with an answer. And my justification was sensors in the sky. Mm-hmm. So we here, you and me and everybody else around us, whether we know it or not, has essentially one job. Mm-hmm. And that job is extend the internet.
The job of Silicon Valley.
The job of Silicon Valley, the technology industry, extend the internet. Extend the internet, into your home, into your desk, into your pocket, onto your wrist, into your car, into the city. Mm-hmm. And my little bit of that was extend the internet into the air. Mm-hmm. The air is weirdly empty. Yep. It's empty because we put humans in harm's way by having them fly.
Yes.
Which God did not intend. When you extend the internet into the physical world, you do two great things. Number one is that you measure the world so you can manage it better.
Yeah.
That's good. And the other is that everything you stick out there is smarter by dint of being connected to the internet. So, the world gets smarter and the internet gets smarter.
Yeah.
And the air was just, you don't see markets. Talk about blue ocean strategy. You don't see very many markets that are ubiquitous and empty.
Yeah.
And the air is kind of ubiquitous and empty.
It's true. It's everywhere. Yeah.
And you look up and there's rarely something up there. So that was the plan. Sensors in the sky. And then, and so that sensors in the sky means it's not about the drone. It's about the data it gathers. Mm-hmm. And then we get into questions of like, well, what data is it gathering and what's it good for? And, how do you use it? And that's where we are today.
Yeah. And so you were looking at a variety of markets to pivot into, and one of them was agricultural, I remember. And you've decided, well, actually, tell us what you decided on.
Well, so, again, recognize that I'm sort of justifying the notion that there's, we're going to measure the world. I don't really know what part of the world to measure. We have satellites as one example, and we have sensors on the ground as another example. I don't know, traffic cams. If you know nothing about the physical world because you live in your basement and you code, you sort of look out there and you sort of think, well, what are the big industries? And the biggest industry in the world is agriculture.
Yep.
And then you say, what do I know about agriculture? And, the answer is, well, we need to feed more people and we need to be more productive. And then you do a little more work and you realize that today agriculture is industrial scale. We use monoculture. We use lots of chemicals, fungicides, herbicides, pesticides to, keep productivity up and pests, disease at bay. But there's big environmental consequences of all that. By the way, nobody works on farms anymore because of reasons. So you think, well, it sounds to me like if you measured, like once upon a time, farmers used to walk their fields and they would know everything. But now farm fields are too big to walk and there aren't very many farmers. So we need to substitute for that kind of, information, awareness of the classic farmer with sensors. So, maybe we should just measure agriculture and we should hey, let's not spray pesticides prophylactically. Let's just wait till you get an outbreak. Lower the chemical load in the food and water, et cetera, increase yield. Passes the cocktail party test.
Yeah.
Hey, what do? I make drones. What are they for? We map crops to feed the world.
We reduce pesticide use by X% because we know where it's needed and where it's not.
Totally.
That would be a hit at a cocktail party.
Clean the environment, feed the world.
Yes. So that was a candidate.
That was a candidate.
Did it fail a subsequent post-cocktail party test?
It did. It did sadly fail.
What test did it fail and why?
The whole "do farmers want it" test.
Ah, really? Why would they not want it? So they must spend a lot of money on pesticides and these things.
They do. They do. Yeah. It's like the number one input cost. Is all that stuff. So it turns out that first of all, there's no one agriculture. That rice is not corn, is not cows, and they're all different, and the different regions are all different, and small farms and big farms, et cetera. So that's one problem. That you can't just sort of say, hey, I have an agricultural solution. They want to know, very specifically, do you have a rice fungus?
What are you doing for sorghum?
Right. And have you calibrated against the rice specialists or the sorghum specialists?
Yeah.
So, again, if you don't know much about ag, that's a hard answer to come up with. And even if you do know a lot about ag, it's a hard answer. The next thing is that it turns out that farmers do not feel pain the way you and I would feel pain. So let's just take yield. You assume farmers want to grow more food.
We would think.
Not always the case. Sometimes there's subsidies. Sometimes there's crop insurance. Sometimes there are government policies that discourage them to plant for fear it's going to lower glut the market, lower prices and things like that. You might assume that farmers would want to lower the chemical load in the ground and water. But you would be wrong. That's a negative externality. And that's,
it's free for them to put,
It's free for them to, I'm not saying farmers want to.
But nonetheless, they don't feel the pain of over pesticizing.
Exactly.
Other than the cost of the pesticide, which has got to be non-trivial.
Right. But getting into the groundwater and moving on, down into the food chain is not necessarily their problem.
They're not charged for that. Yes.
You might also think that in the middle of a drought that a farmer would want to conserve water. But if they have water rights that were secured decades ago, they might not.
Right. As we found in California, oftentimes the ability to wrest water from the farmers can be very, very constrained because of these ancient rights.
So basically, I made the assumption that market forces were at play.
But it was very
in agriculture, and it's a very distorted market.
Got it. And then you'd have to understand each and every one of those distortions on a local basis, on a crop by crop basis.
And it would help to be in Kansas.
And it would be hundreds and hundreds of weird micro markets that are subject to lobbying or something.
Exactly.
So you came to the built world, for lack of a better word.
I did.
So let's talk about that. Reality capture.
So right now I know that measuring the world's in abstract, good, that you can manage it. I know there's a bunch of industries that could potentially be measured. We talked about ag. It also includes things like insurance. There could be infrastructure inspection. There's also search and rescue and fire and first responder. And there's also construction. And another industry I didn't know very much about at the time.
Another biggie,
second biggest industry
after
in the world.
ag.
And if you were just going to simply rank industries, construction, which is architecture, civil engineering, construction, it's the built world. That is the second largest industry in terms of dollars, second largest employer. It's and growing very fast. Also not very digital. Probably one of the least digitized. And unlike another big one like healthcare, where it's also not very digital, but is highly protected by laws and regulations.
Intensely regulated.
Yeah, construction's actually not that regulated. That they do feel the market forces and they do feel the pain. But I didn't know that at the time. What I did know is that a good friend of mine, a guy named Carl Bass, the CEO of Autodesk at the time, who, he and I nerded out. He's also a maker. He's got a fantastic workshop in Berkeley. He lives in Berkeley. We play tennis together. And we nerded out on things like CNC machines. And he's got the best of the best. If you've ever been to like any of the Autodesk, Pier 9 or the gallery, you've seen the cool stuff they have. So he had the coolest stuff, and I got to hang out with him. But the other thing Autodesk does is they're the market leader in construction. So AutoCAD, for example, they have like 80% market share. And Carl and I were nerding out about the manufacturing side of Autodesk. And they also, by the way, have the Hollywood side, the Maya. So basically models. Yeah. This would be some models turn into buildings, some models turn into manufactured parts, and some models turn into Hollywood CG.
Yeah.
But they're all models.
Yeah.
So Carl and I, started by nerding out on the manufacturing side, but the one of the three legs of that stool was construction. And I learned more about construction. Construction is a world that begins digital on screen with the CAD. And then the moment you dig a spade of dirt, it's analog. And you can't manage it with the same tools used to design it.
I'm sorry, the moment you dig a spade of dirt, it's
analog.
It's totally analog.
It's analog, yeah. It's paper, blueprints.
Yep.
Guys with hard hats and vests. And so you can't manage it with the same tools used to design it. And so, Carl was talking about this, digital, analog, digital conversion process by which it starts digital, it then becomes analog once you dig, and then you had to redigitize it. So you could could you continue managing it with the same tools you used to design it?
You had to redigit. Now, how did the redigitization proceed? So
well, they didn't. It didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the notion. The notion was you had to digitize the physical world, but how?
Yeah.
And so in the early days, everyone thought it was going to be laser scanners. You're just going to laser scan LiDAR with laser scan in particular, but laser scanners, expensive, hard to use, hard to carry, limited to the ground and indoors, et cetera. And so there's this broad theme of reality capture. So this notion of digitizing the physical world is what we call reality capture. So like in Hollywood, you do motion capture.
Yeah.
Right. But for the physical world, it's called reality capture. There's 3 phases. At the beginning, you have a site. And now you're scanning the land, the slope, the soil, the existing stuff that needs to be removed. It's called cut and fill, the holes, the sand, everything has to come in.
Yeah.
Then, so that's the site characterization, called a design surface and then an engineering surface. And that's so you can actually, when you design something on screen, you're designing on something that's real. That was scanned. It's accurate.
So precise knowledge of the topography when you're starting. Yeah.
Exactly. Then you start building.
Yep.
And now you're essentially you're monitoring construction and you're checking for deviations, what's called clashes in the industry. So every day the plan said, trench goes here, pipe goes there, concrete goes there, and at the end of every day, you find out whether that happened or not. And if it didn't, that's a clash.
And the details, so to my novice brain, the plans are the blueprint of the finished building. But what you're telling me is there are step 1, step 2, step 3 plans as well that say dig trench number 1, connect to hole A.
You can imagine all the things that go wrong. There could be the simple thing like, hey, there was a big rock there, so I made an audible. I changed on the fly. That's one set of plans. Another one is, hey, I was supposed to dig there, but oops. It's off a little bit because I was eyeballing off some orange pole. A next one could be, hey, I was supposed to dig the trench today, but the trench guy didn't show up. So we're going to save that till tomorrow.
Got it. So the trench at this moment ain't there. And nobody really knows this but the people who are on the very, very front lines. And so what is the notion then with the drone solutions? You're taking a constant dynamic picture. Is it a daily dynamic picture?
It should be.
It should be.
That's the beauty of zero marginal cost scanning. So robot scanning should have no marginal cost.
Yeah.
Which is to say, it's just electricity. It should just automatically go up and scan it every day and every hour, et cetera. Then you could monitor progress, like what's the actual state.
Yep.
You can monitor clashes, what changed,
and then you can make sure those clashes are embedded in this living document.
Then you update the model. So some of those clashes are like, oopsie, let's go back and fix that. Some of those clashes are, sequencing, let's change the orders for tomorrow. So the trench guy doesn't have to show up because the pipe guy. Maybe I got it backwards, but the pipe guy doesn't have to show up because the trench guy didn't show up.
Yeah.
Another one might be, hey, reasonable change made, but it's going to have consequences downstream for the guys who are going to come in the concrete, et cetera. Let's make sure that the model's accurate.
Let's make sure we update the next several steps because this person faced with a difficult situation did the right thing, but we need to make sure that is updated in the living document so that it's known forever that wall was actually 4 feet away from where it was originally intended, and everybody who's impacted by that will know when the time comes.
It happens so often that the trench guy, for reasonable reasons, dug a trench that has a 45-degree bend, and the pipe guy wasn't told, and he brought straight pipe.
Got it. So instead of having an idealized snapshot of the building before you start building it, which the blueprint might be. Right. This is almost like having a live video feed of it. And
it's a living model.
And that is essentially what your product is now.
It is. Well, so we contribute to that. So we do one of the inputs, the capture that goes into the reality capture. And this notion of it's called BIM, Building Information Modeling. This notion of a multi-dimensional. So we were just talking about spatial dimensions. Yeah. There's also things like time and cost dimensions and supply chain.
So you are the sensors in the sky that are basically the live video camera on the construction site.
Not video, stills, actually. Yeah.
Or what I mean, I'm using it euphemistically, but essentially the live image, live in quotes. You're the ones who are updating this visual. And so if you're short 20 tons of concrete, you'll know that.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's actually not. I mean, it is visual, but what we do is we turn those photos through a process called photogrammetry. You turn them into 3D models and point clouds, etc. So it all looks like a CAD file when you're done. It's a neat technique. Photogrammetry is basically when you when you look at a feature from different angles, because of the parallax effect. So if I'm shooting this coconut water from bottle from here and from one side and to the other side, the same feature will have different foreground backgrounds because I moved the camera.
Yeah.
And when you just use the parallax effect, you can extract the geometries by just looking at the difference in foreground background. So photogrammetry turns visual images into polygons and point clouds.
So the stills that you're able to take basically results in a robust 3D model that a site manager, a project manager can look at and find out if this thing is actually on target or 8 months late and 40% of her budget.
Yeah, and there's loads of different kinds of, sometimes they want to see it in 2D, sometimes they want to see contours, sometimes they want to see elevation maps, sometimes they want to see 3D models, sometimes there's a bunch of different things. But the point is that just putting a camera in the sky can largely achieve all of those.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you had said is robotic sensors are free. At this point, isn't there an enormous amount of regulatory control over the drone market that basically says, even if it could be autonomous and robotic, it doesn't get to be because there has to be a human pilot. And not only does there have to be a human pilot, but they need to be in a line of sight. How is that impacting your and other industries right now? And does it feel to you, as an intensely sophisticated observer of this industry, like an unbelievably archaic thing like pilot as performance art? Or is it something that's a really reasonable regulatory step to take, lest people have drones landing on their faces or something?
Yeah, it's more the latter.
More the
reasonable.
Art. More the reasonable. Okay,
more the reasonable.
Okay.
So a year ago, it was illegal to fly drones commercially.
I know, which is fascinating. Yeah.
Weirdly, as a child can get a drone under the Christmas tree and fly anytime they want under what's called the recreational use exemption.
Yeah.
But if a trained professional wanted to use that same drone
to make money,
that was at the time it required a pilot's license and an impossible permissioning process.
So a kid could launch a very powerful drone. A wedding photographer launching a less powerful drone would be in violation of the law.
Correct.
Got it. And that was only a year ago that was
until August of last year.
What was the logic of that?
You regulate who you can regulate.
Got it. Can't regulate kids.
You can't send a C&D to a kid.
Yeah.
They just...
C&D, cease and desist.
Cease and desist.
Yeah.
Exactly. You regulate the entities that have the legal requirement to obey regulation.
And the point of that was, given that we presumably had lots of kids, un-C&D-able kids out there flying stuff.
The point was they never anticipated that kids would be flying drones.
Yeah.
Right? Drones are military devices. It was just never considered. It was a loophole.
Do you think that the fact that there was so drones, you started DIY drones in 2007. Yeah. Lots of excited grown-ups doing stuff.
Yeah.
Now, if we go into the computing industry and say what was the equivalent of 2007, it would probably be Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak around 1976?
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah.
10 years after that, well, it was 9 years before they lift that commercial restriction. So the equivalent of that would be 1985 in computing. By 1985, there was so much commercial computing going on in so many businesses, big and small, financial service industry, hair salons and the whole nine. There was so much commercial activity. Do you think it's possible that the fact that the government said for 9 years in your industry, thou shalt not use this commercially, in some ways stifled the industry in a way that made DJI's success inevitable? Because there was no economic activity was allowed in a domain that was very robust, that lots and lots of grown-ups, many of them no doubt entrepreneurial, were doing all kinds of cool things with their soldering irons and your plans in 2007. And it sounds like it was not until 2016 before somebody said you can use it as a wedding photographer.
Counselor, you're leading the witness.
Well, no,
you would expect me to agree.
No, I'm genuinely asking. I don't.
No, so it would be very easy to blame the regulators. Actually, I think the regulators have, for a while they were not moving at all.
Yeah.
Because we use this, I'm going to say loophole, but basically because the regulations had not anticipated DIY and drones going together, we put 1 million drones in the air in the hands of children and amateurs, et cetera. And those drones were not going back into the box.
Right.
So the regulators were forced to bring them into the fold. They couldn't say no anymore, so they had to sort of say, well, yes, but.
Yeah.
And that yes, but included some, taking away the requirement, for example, to have a pilot's license.
Yeah.
When you're flying commercially. And so now there's basically a driver's license. It's called Part 107.
Yeah.
And I think that was faster than than most people had expected.
Yeah.
So now, and that happened last year. And you could argue, well, that should have happened 10 years earlier. But the reality is that, if you ask why is the sky not dark with drones today, I don't think that regulation is the main answer. I think the main answer is that the utility of these things is not well enough demonstrated. If it was clear to everybody that $1 invested in drones is $10 of return, I think the sky would be dark. They'd find a way.
Or $1.20. It doesn't have to be as extreme as that.
This is always the case. It was true with the early days of the internet. It was true, computing before the spreadsheet was a little bit of a gimmick.
Yeah.
So that year 85 you described, that was, when did whatever the first spreadsheet come out?
VisiCalc would have been the first one. It was Apple. Well, VisiCalc was Apple II. And
a little bit earlier.
Sure, but
until you had a killer app.
Sure, but that killer app would not have arisen if the Federal Communications Commission or somebody, the FDA equivalent, said, okay, we're a little bit sketchy about these computers because they've been used in a lot of James Bond movies and governments like to use them. And this is really the domain of the government and the military. So, okay, we can't stop these kids from using computers, but commercial software, all right? And so ergo no VisiCalc in 1978.
Well, remember the internet?
Yeah.
When was commercial use of the internet allowed?
The very first, I don't know if it was ever disallowed, but the first ads were sold on the internet by GNN by Tim O'Reilly.
No.
Well, the first ads. Well, so he said yesterday.
Well, ask Lewis and Jane. They'll claim the first ads were sold by Wired.
Oh, no. They'll claim they'll claim the first banner ads and they'll be right about
that. I see.
Yeah. But the first advertising was GNN.
Fair enough.
Because Hotwired was launched in 1994.
But no, you're thinking about the web. But remember the internet, the notion of .com, the notion of commercial use of the internet. That was like 95.
Yeah.
You literally were not allowed. It was like against the law to use the internet for commercial purposes before then.
Yeah.
Would my life be easier if there were no regulations whatsoever on commercial use of drones? In a little bit, yes.
Yeah.
But remember, if, what I call mass jackassery, I'm kind of glad that people are thoughtful about the use of drones. I'm kind of glad that we're not causing public scares about privacy.
Well, paparazzi and stuff like that.
We've seen what happens.
Yeah.
A drone just hit a Black Hawk yesterday.
Oh, really?
The last thing we need right now is this whole thing to get shut down because...
A Hindenburg moment of some kind. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
I can live... And, I think we have so much work to be done on the return on investment, sort of the killer app side, that I don't feel particularly inhibited by the regulatory side.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you are one who, in some ways, has a fairly libertarian perspective, and you have a level of sophistication about this market that is, at minimum, 2 orders of magnitude beyond my own. So the fact that you are not feeling alarm or concern or dismay about this regulatory situation is frankly good enough for me, because I know how deep you are into this realm, and I know that you're not instinctively a lover of regulation against non-regulation.
And remember, it's a big world out there, and if I don't like the regulations here, there's Canada, there's Australia, there's drone delivery. The Amazon concept is not happening here for regulations, at least not now. But you go to Rwanda.
Yeah.
There it is.
Zipline is an amazing thing, because basically what they've done is they've taken fixed wing drones, which are more efficient in terms of their energy usage rather than quadcopters. And I guess they've started using drones to deliver blood to remote places, and they're going to be moving up to vaccines and other things that are highly perishable and can't go on long journeys through forest roads. And that is, what Zipline does in Rwanda, you're saying really could not be done from a regulatory standpoint, would not be permitted here in the United States right now. Let's talk briefly about the future, what drones are going to do and what they're not going to do.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Amazon home delivery thing. You are a skeptic about that.
I am, but not because I don't have any lack of confidence in Amazon. I just think that you combine, it's just a really hard technical and regulatory problem. That particular vision, by the way, Amazon buying Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Warehouse to the roof of Whole Foods via drone. Sign me up.
Oh, yeah.
Drone zones, drop-off zones. I totally get that.
Yep. But you'll still have to go to Whole Foods to pick that stuff up.
Amazon, Whole Foods to, my backyard with the dog and the kids and the clotheslines. I just can't wrap my head around that.
Yeah. And not even if they're lowering it on a cable from 200 feet or something. If you have to be a windless day or.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be done.
Yeah.
I know that. I just, when I look at the economics, when I look at the other ways to deliver packages to my home, which seem to work pretty well.
The taco copter is not something you expect to be ubiquitous.
I mean, and plus, San Francisco banned pot delivery by drone. So there goes your killer app.
There goes the killer app. That was a very high dollar value per ounce of shipped product. What about sort of the sidewalk drone things? I mean, I've been seeing pictures. Well, cars, of course. I want to talk about that in a second. But there was there's one product out there, and I've forgotten the name of the company behind it, that sort of does that last mile thing by ambling down the sidewalk, because self-driving cars are a regulatory issue. Maybe self-driving, I don't know.
So I thought the
R2D2s.
drones, with their noise, were the most annoying thing you could have in the urban environment. But it turns out I was wrong. Sidewalk robots trigger, even the most kind of, capitalist libertarian folks gets all sort of, class warfare when they see a robot trundling down to deliver somebody a burrito.
Is that right?
They just want to abuse those things.
There's just
because that's our
vandalism.
Sidewalk. Get off my sidewalk.
It's vandalism. Or just
it's
dismay.
People hate tech bros on sidewalks, and even if they're robotic.
Got it. Do you see anything? I mean, some of the most amazing demos that I've seen of drones recently, in videos online and so forth, are what swarms can do. Particularly with what swarms can do with visual, pyrotechnics.
Yeah.
But just also what swarms can do in terms of just being self-organizing and accomplishing lots of teeny tiny tasks as a group. Do you see anything in the intermediate term using swarms of perhaps micro miniature drones to do things that one might not imagine a drone doing today?
This is where I'm going to lose any friends I've made on this thing. Every grad student I've ever interviewed, for a job here, has always studied swarms. With the exception of Intel's very pretty fireworks displays, I've yet to find an actual application.
All right.
Every grad student loves swarms because it's such a cool math problem. No actual problems I can think of, with possible exception of some crazy military thing I don't know anything about.
Yeah.
It's gotten to the point where, like, if someone actually has done swarming in their grad research, they get eliminated on this year, because first of all, it's such a cliche at this point. Second of all, it's just intellectual pursuits without any recognition of marketplace needs. Second of all, there really are no marketplace needs. I can't think of anything whatsoever. Look, I can articulate the case for swarms as well as anybody. It's parallel processing, distributed coordination, etc. I've yet to encounter a problem out there that actually suits a swarm.
Apart from looking kind of cool.
The fireworks are aside from entertainment.
Yeah.
I cannot find. I mean, I've been at this a time, and I've done my share of swarming, and you're on the roof out there. We've done our share of swarming. So technically done.
Yeah.
Achievable. No one has ever asked me. No customer has ever asked me for a swarm, or at least been willing to pay for one.
Got it. And what about extreme miniaturization? I mean, another thing that is always thrilling when and there was a TED Talk not long ago of the hummingbird, which I'll say a hummingbird that sounds about as loud as a tractor mower would make.
Do you know how many of those were made? Well, first of all, do you know how much they cost and how much were made?
Well, because they're military, I'm sure that they would cost a staggering sum. But
I think it was $1.5 million for one.
Yeah, but they've
never made another one. But they never will make another.
They never will, because it sounds like a tractor mower.
It's like the most exquisite, beautifully designed Swiss watch.
Yeah.
With miniaturization, you're up against physics. So physics just doesn't scale down. Once you get into little small stuff, the wind turbulence becomes a bigger issue compared to the overall, surface area of the surfaces. Yeah. We have not figured out. So a bird can turn a worm into a day's worth of flight, which is really more about digestion than anything else. Until we can figure out how to do that, we've got serious power problems. You know what that hummingbird's flight time was?
No.
I think it was 180 seconds.
That's not long.
No.
Yeah, you can't get a whole lot done. And so are there new markets or new applications that you can imagine when the cost of a real multiplicity of sensors in the sky being de facto or for all intents and purposes free, things that we couldn't really conceive of now that might come into sharper focus in the 5-10 year time frame?
Well, we're starting to see a little bit of a proxy for this with microsats or CubeSats, et cetera. So companies like Planet Labs are now sending up these constellations of what they call doves.
Yep.
So it used to be that satellites in space, cameras in space were crazy expensive and only for the few, and now they're getting cheap and for the many.
Yeah, Planet's put up, 1,000 satellites or something crazy?
I mean, it's all, well, remember these things, because they're in low Earth orbit, they fall out of orbit. So it's not like it's, they say that you're kind of replenishing constellations, but I can't remember what the replenishment cycle is. But let's imagine that there's a lot. Yeah. And there's a lot more coming. And, between SpaceX, getting them to space and the actual cost of them, of the satellites themselves, it's approaching zero.
Yep.
But clouds, focal, the optics and all that kind of stuff. You still don't have ubiquitous eyes in the sky. Yeah. 80% of the planet's covered by clouds.
80% at any given moment.
At any given moment, yeah. Yeah. So you don't have ubiquitous eyes in the sky. Meanwhile, you have sensors on the ground. Yeah. Streets and cars and things like that, but also not ubiquitous coverage. Yeah. And so there's clearly an opportunity for certain areas to get ubiquitous coverage below the clouds, but above the ground. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And that's the opportunity for drones. It's not everywhere. Yeah. I hope it's not over our cities. Yeah. That would kind of be creepy, but it could certainly be over security, over campuses. Yeah. Certainly over construction sites. Yeah. I haven't given up on ag. I personally, as a company, have given up on ag, but as a person, I still think that someone's gonna, the notion of drones over farms is going to be certainly more common than crop dusters over farms.
Yeah. It just seems logical.
I mean, why not? But, well, I guess we just talk about why not, but someday.
Yeah. Well, you've been wildly generous with your time, Chris.
Thank you. This is always fun.
I appreciate it immensely. And once we get off mic, you will sign this album for me.
I will, but what should I sign it?
I don't know. That's your job. I'm handed books a lot now that I got a new book out, and I'm always stymied, but I always come up with something.
We outlasted REM.
You did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you for listening to my conversation with Chris Anderson. As you could probably tell, I had a huge amount of fun with it. My sole disappointment is that I was hoping for a bit more starry-eyed, speculative, wired-like prognostication about some way cool next-generation uses for drones when I brought up the subjects of drone swarms, ultra-miniaturization, and a couple other things toward the end. But one of the many things why Chris was a great editor of that magazine is that he is, at bottom, a realist. He only goes on those sorts of riffs when he truly believes in them. And in this case, he knows the subject cold and just doesn't buy into the notion of taco copters delivering food to our backyards or thousands of microdrones living in hives. One thing that's evident from this interview is Chris's enormous generosity of spirit in talking about people who've really messed with his business. First, his Chinese competitor, DJI. As you heard, he's very impressed with that company and goes out of his way to praise them as an innovator and not just a copier as some might allege, and basically says they won fair and square. Very few other CEOs that I've known, probably as few as zero, would be this charitable about a competitor that waged a scorched earth campaign which successfully terminated that CEO's principal line of business. But from all I've heard about DJI, Chris is not just generous, but correct in his assessment, as it is, by all accounts, a truly amazing and innovative company. Where I diverge with Chris, after listening to this interview 3 or 4 times after the fact, is on his generosity toward the regulators who forbade the use of drones for commercial purposes for almost a decade in the U.S. Chris said that if you ask why the sky is not dark with drones, a great phrase, by the way, regulation is not the main reason, but rather it's the lack of killer apps. And if you don't know that term, it originated in the PC era to describe applications that made PCs an essential item for significant markets of people and companies. In the interview, Chris and I specifically talked about the spreadsheet in this context. The thing is, markets generally don't produce killer apps when it's illegal to sell them. A great application of technology, whether it's a world-class spreadsheet or an automated drone-based crop dusting solution, takes teams of expensive people and significant time to build. And companies just won't invest the necessary capital if they know that once they're done, they could face a 5-year wait for some bureaucrat to grant them permission to be in business. I conceded the point in my interview with Chris, deferring to his immense expertise in this field. And it's a bit unfair for me to take that concession back now when I'm the only one holding a microphone here. But on reflection, I just can't ignore the circularity of commercial drones not becoming a big deal for a lack of great killer apps, during a decade when the development of such applications would have been, for all intents and purposes, illegal. More than most fields, drones drew hordes of passionate makers and tinkerers. These people are often quite highly entrepreneurial by nature, and that vast, tightly coupled, and wildly enthusiastic community could have unleashed all kinds of early commercial products. And a few of them may have created entirely new markets that we can't imagine simply because they haven't been created yet. Those markets might have been vital lifelines to 3DR as the consumer market shriveled under DJI's attack, leaving only the commercial market. Now, we can't rerun history, so who knows? But this really seems like a case in which U.S. regulators strangled a market which was born largely of American innovation to the great benefit of China. Now, I don't fault Chris's judgment in this at all, and I'll again concede that he knows far more about this stuff than I do. But he's also in the top percentile when it comes to generosity of spirit, as I just mentioned, and that very admirable quality may be doing some of the talking here. So, that wraps up the first post-novel related episode of the After On podcast. And because I don't have any advertising or any other way of recouping my expenses on this podcast, which I will have to address at some point, but not now, I hope you'll tolerate me closing with a shout out to the novel, which is starting to reach a decently wide audience of people. We're closing in on about 10,000 copies sold across all formats since it entered the world 2 months ago, which is quite good for a long and challenging novel. It would probably be lousy for James Patterson or somebody, but that just isn't me. Like all creative works, this one is not for everybody. But if you're listening to and enjoying this podcast, the odds are decent that you're one of the folks who'd really enjoy it. After On, if you want to know what it's about, it's the tale of a rather diabolical social media company called Flutter, spelled Phlutr, because we know how to spell in Silicon Valley. Contrary to the interest of anyone connected to it, Flutter attains consciousness by processes connected to 2 prior episodes of this podcast. Episode 2, in which I talked to UCSF neuroscientist Adam Gazzaley about consciousness, and Episode 5, in which I talked to venture capitalist Steve Jurvetson about quantum computing. Being a social network, Flutter doesn't turn into some kind of genocidal Terminator, but something far more frightening. The digital equivalent of a super-empowered, hyper-intelligent, 14-year-old mean girl. As you can probably tell from that description, there's a lot of playful sections in the book, which is the case with everything I write. To give you an example, my last novel, Year Zero, concerned a vast alien civilization that's so obsessed with American pop music that they accidentally commit the biggest copyright infringement since the dawn of time, thereby bankrupting the entire universe. You can bet that playful sections abound in that one. But in After On, the playfulness actually leavens a number of very serious and terrifying issues that the book grapples with very deeply. And when I say terrifying, I mean to me, the author, who spent 3 years researching and writing this thing. They include super AI risk, as discussed in episode 7 of this podcast with James Barrett, the dangers of synthetic biology, a field which also holds out immense promise to humanity, I'll add. That's the topic of episode 4 with Andy Hessel, nihilistic terrorism, which Sam Harris and I dig deeply into in episode 6, government hacking and intrusion, which Cindy Cohn and I discuss in episode 2, and so much more. The book's set in the present day, and as you can hopefully tell from this podcast, I was intensely serious about researching and presenting the science and technology of the book in a manner that's consistent with the world we live in, and also educating, while I hope spinning a really fun tale. Now, the good news is you don't have to take a chance on this thing. You can get free samples of it on any digital reader if you have access to one. And if you own a computer, tablet, or smartphone, you do, because you can get free copies of digital readers like Kindle from Amazon on all of those platforms. I've also put all kinds of excerpts up on Medium, and Audible has free previews of the audiobook on their site. Just a quick word about that audiobook. It's magnificent, in part because it's not read by me, but by actual professionals from the realms of acting, comedy, and beyond. People like Felicia Day, John Hodgman, Patrick Rothfuss, Leo Laporte, my old co-host Tom Merritt. The list goes on. And people seem to like the audiobook. As I'm recording this roughly 24 hours before posting this episode, there are already 424 ratings and reviews of it on the Audible website. And I'm proud to say that 272 of them are 5 stars and 101 are 4 stars. So almost 90% of buyers really like the audiobook. Plus, there's an even higher average rating for the written book on the Amazon site, although there are far fewer reviews there at this point for whatever reason. So thanks for listening to my pitch, and I hope you'll consider sampling this book. And if you don't, I still thank you for listening to this podcast. Its creation brings me great joy. So thank you for encouraging me to continue with it. And next week, I'll have an amazing and thought-provoking conversation with Tim O'Reilly, one of the most original and influential thinkers in the field of technology.